Welcome to Story Planet, where we bring you peaceful tales to help you unwind. Tonight's story is The Hilltop Haven, a journey into a quiet life where the land provides and the seasons guide each day. Follow the Greenwood family as they wake with the sun, gather the gifts of the earth, and embrace the simple joys of their hilltop home. So, settle in, get cozy, and let yourself drift into a world where time slows, the fire crackles, and the wind whispers through the trees. Now, let's begin. The morning of a new life. The sun stretched its golden fingers over the rolling green hills, gently peeling away the last wisps of morning mist. The Greenwood family had long awakened, their day beginning with the rhythm of the earth itself. Birds chirped, bees hummed, and the crisp mountain air carried the scent of damp earth and wildflowers. It was a morning much like any other. Yet in the quiet simplicity of their life, every sunrise felt like a gift. William Greenwood, a sturdy man with calloused hands and a heart full of patience, stood at the edge of the hilltop, surveying his land. He had built this life with his wife Lena, a woman with gentle eyes and a quiet strength. Their children, Thomas and Eliza, had never known a life beyond this haven, and to them, the outside world was but a distant hum beyond the valley. The day started with Lena stoking the hearth fire, while Thomas fetched water from the nearby spring. The sound of rushing water, cold and fresh, was a melody that played throughout their lives. Eliza, barely 10, scurried to the henhouse, her small hands gathering warm eggs nestled in hay. The cows in the barn lowed softly, waiting for William to milk them, while the goats perched on the stone walls, their curious eyes watching the morning unfold. Breakfast was a simple affair, freshly churned butter on thick slices of bread, golden honey from their own hives drizzled over warm porridge, and milk still frothy from the morning's milking. The family sat outside, eating while the rising sun bathed the hilltop in light. Beyond them, the valley stretched endlessly, a sea of green undisturbed by modern life. Once the meal was done, the day's work began in earnest. William and Thomas took to the fields, turning the rich soil and planting crops that would sustain them through the seasons. The plow cut deep, releasing the sweet scent of the earth into the air. Beside them, their old horse, Chestnut, trod patiently, aiding in their labor. Eliza followed Lena to the herb garden, where fragrant rosemary, lavender, and thyme grew in neat rows. Lena knelt, her fingers deftly plucking sprigs of fresh herbs, explaining their uses as she worked. Some would be dried for winter, others used fresh in stews and teas. Their garden was a living pharmacy, offering remedies for aches, fevers, and restless nights. The bees were already at work, their hive nestled in a cluster of lavender bushes. Thomas, ever fascinated by the tiny creatures, watched as they buzzed around, carrying pollen from flower to flower. He knew how important they were. Without them, the orchards and fields would not bear the same fruit. William had taught him the art of beekeeping, a skill passed down through generations. He understood the careful balance, how nature rewarded those who worked with it, rather than against it. By midday, the sun had climbed high, warming the land and driving the family indoors for a brief respite. Lena had prepared chamomile tea, its gentle aroma filling the cool shade of their wooden cottage. They sat around the table, discussing the rest of the day's tasks. There was always work to be done. Fences to mend, hay to store, bread to bake, but there was no rush. Life here moved at its own pace, dictated by the turning of the seasons rather than the ticking of clocks. The afternoon saw William and Thomas repairing the barn roof, a task long overdue. The summer rains would soon arrive, and a leaky roof could spell trouble for their stored grain. Eliza helped her mother knead dough for the evening's bread, the rhythmic motion a comforting routine. Outside, the wind rustled through the apple trees, their blossoms promising a fruitful harvest to come. As dusk settled over the hill, the family gathered once more outside. The sky turned hues of orange and pink, a breathtaking canvas that never ceased to amaze them. Lena set the table with bowls of hearty stew, thick slices of bread, and fresh cheese made from their morning's milk. The children ate eagerly, their laughter mingling with the chirping of crickets and the distant hoot of an owl. After supper, William brought out his old fiddle, its worn strings carrying a melody that had been played on this hilltop for generations. Eliza and Thomas swayed to the music, their feet moving in an impromptu dance on the grass. The fire crackled beside them, casting long shadows that flickered against the barn walls. As the night deepened, the family retreated inside, the warmth of the hearth wrapping around them like a familiar embrace. Lena tucked Eliza into bed, brushing stray curls from her daughter's forehead. "Sleep well, little one," she whispered. "Tomorrow is another day." William stood by the window, looking out at the moonlit fields. He felt a deep contentment, knowing that here, atop their hill, they had everything they needed. Their life was simple, yet rich in ways that mattered. The lanterns were blown out one by one, and as the Greenwood family drifted into slumber, the world outside continued its quiet symphony. The rustling leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the soft hum of the wind. Life in the Hilltop Haven was peaceful, and as the stars watched over them, the promise of another beautiful day lay just beyond the dawn. Roots and harvests. The morning mist had barely lifted when William stepped onto the damp grass, breathing in the crisp scent of the hills. The rising sun cast a golden hue over the fields, painting everything in warm light. This was his favorite part of the day, the stillness before the labor, the promise of what lay ahead. Lena emerged from the cottage, a basket in her hands filled with fresh bread and cheese. She handed a warm slice to William, who ate as he walked toward the vegetable patch. Thomas, eager to learn, followed close behind, carrying the tools they would need for the day's work. Eliza, still rubbing sleep from her eyes, skipped toward the henhouse to gather the morning's eggs. The vegetable garden was alive with growth. Rows of tomatoes, carrots, beans, and lettuce stood proudly in the fertile soil. William knelt beside a cluster of potatoes, his hands skillfully brushing the dirt away to check their progress. "Another week, and they'll be ready for harvest," he said, satisfaction in his voice. Thomas watched closely, mimicking his father's movements as they worked the earth together. Meanwhile, Lena and Eliza had made their way to the orchard, where apples, peaches, and plums hung heavy on the branches. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, their leaves whispering secrets only the wind could understand. Eliza climbed onto a sturdy branch, reaching for the ripest apples while Lena carefully picked peaches, inspecting each one before placing it in her woven basket. Back at the house, Lena set to work preserving their bounty. Jars of honey gleamed in the sunlight, lined up neatly beside pots of jam and bottles of cider. She sliced apples for drying, laying them out on wooden racks near the hearth. The scent of cinnamon and fruit filled the kitchen as she worked, humming a tune passed down from her mother. Outside, William and Thomas mended the wooden fence that surrounded the pasture, ensuring the cows and goats remained safe. Their sturdy hands worked methodically, hammering nails and securing loose planks. The animals, content and well-fed, grazed lazily under the midday sun. By the afternoon, the family gathered beneath the grand oak tree for a well-earned rest. Lena poured cool water from a clay jug, handing cups to each of them as they settled into the shade. They spoke in soft tones, discussing plans for the coming weeks, when to plant the next crops, when to gather firewood for winter, when to prepare the beehives for the colder months ahead. As the day waned, the family's work slowed. Lena prepared supper, roasting fresh vegetables over the fire while bread baked in the stone oven. William and Thomas brought in the last of the hay, their muscles aching from a day well spent. By nightfall, the family sat together outside, watching the sky turn into a deep canvas of stars. The crickets began their nightly symphony, blending with the distant call of an owl. Lena handed out slices of warm bread with honey, a simple but satisfying end to the day. Eliza rested her head against her mother's lap, her eyes fluttering shut. Thomas, still full of energy, traced constellations in the sky with his fingers. William, content, leaned back against the tree trunk, listening to the familiar sounds of their land. Here, on the hilltop, life was not rushed. Each day was a gift, measured not in minutes but in the steady rhythm of nature. And as sleep claimed the family one by one, the land whispered its lullaby, promising another day of quiet abundance. A summer of abundance. The summer sun rose early over the hilltop, spilling golden light across the rolling fields. The land was alive with the hum of bees, the rustling of leaves, and the distant sound of a brook winding its way through the valley. The warmth of the season had transformed the land into a place of boundless bounty, and the Greenwood family embraced it with open arms. The orchard stood heavy with fruit. Apples, peaches, and plums drooped from the branches, their sweet fragrance perfuming the air. Lena and Eliza ventured into the trees early in the morning, carrying woven baskets to collect the ripest fruits before the midday heat set in. Eliza loved the feel of the smooth peaches against her palms, their soft fuzz tickling her fingers as she plucked them from the branches. Meanwhile, William and Thomas turned their attention to the honeybees, whose hives had flourished in the summer months. Dressed in protective veils, they carefully lifted wooden frames thick with golden honey. The bees buzzed in rhythmic harmony, their tireless work a reflection of the family's own dedication to the land. "This batch is richer than last season's," William remarked as he inspected the thick amber liquid dripping from the comb. Back at the cottage, Lena stood over the stone counter, slicing peaches for preserves. The kitchen was warm with the scent of fruit and cinnamon, the steam rising from bubbling pots of jam. She hummed softly as she worked, stirring the mixture with a wooden spoon, ensuring each jar captured the very essence of summer's sweetness. Jars of honey lined the shelves beside bottles of fruit syrup, ready to last them through the colder months. By midday, the family retreated beneath the shade of the grand oak tree. The sprawling branches provided shelter from the heat, their leaves casting dappled shadows on the cool grass. Lena passed around slices of fresh bread, still warm from the oven, drizzled with honey and paired with cheese made from their morning's milk. They ate in companionable silence, the only sounds the whisper of the breeze and the gentle calls of songbirds perched in the nearby trees. Afternoons were spent in preparation. The cellar, which stored their preserved goods, needed organizing. Thomas and William stacked sacks of dried grains and tied bunches of herbs to hang from the wooden beams. Lena and Eliza carefully wrapped rounds of cheese in cloth, ensuring they aged properly in the cool stone chamber beneath their home. As the sun began to dip beyond the hills, the family made their way to the fields, where golden stalks of wheat swayed in the breeze. It was nearly time for the harvest. William ran his fingers through the grains, feeling their ripeness. "A few more days, and we'll begin the reaping," he said with satisfaction. The thought of freshly milled flour and the loaves it would yield filled them all with eager anticipation. By evening, the air cooled, bringing a much-needed relief from the heat. The family gathered around the outdoor fire pit, their dinner a simple meal of roasted vegetables, fresh goat cheese, and thick slices of bread. Fireflies flickered in the dusk, dancing like tiny lanterns against the darkening sky. Lena wrapped a shawl around her shoulders as she leaned back against William, watching Eliza chase fireflies through the tall grass, her laughter a melody that blended with the chirping crickets. Thomas sat with his back against a log, whittling a small wooden figure with careful hands. As the fire crackled, William spoke. "Summer always reminds me how lucky we are. The land provides, and we have everything we need right here. Lena nodded, her gaze drifting toward the rolling hills that stretched beyond their home. And it will keep providing as long as we care for it. As the stars began to pepper the sky, the family slowly made their way inside, their bodies weary but hearts full. The scent of summer still clung to the air, and as they settled into bed, the land whispered once more, promising another day of warmth, work, and quiet joy. The Dance of the Rain. The first monsoon rains arrived unannounced, sweeping across the hilltop with a whisper before turning into a steady downpour. The clouds had gathered thick and low since dawn, their deep gray hues a stark contrast to the golden days of summer. The Greenwood family had anticipated the rains, stacking bundles of firewood beneath the eaves and ensuring the thatched roof was properly reinforced. William stood at the edge of the barn, watching the rain drench the land. Droplets tapped rhythmically against the wooden beams, filling the air with the earthy scent of wet soil and fresh greenery. He smiled to himself, knowing that the rain was a blessing. The river would swell, the crops would drink deeply, and the air would turn crisp and clean. Inside the cottage, Lena stirred a pot of thick vegetable stew over the hearth, the rich aroma spreading warmth through the home. Eliza sat by the window, tracing patterns on the glass, mesmerized by the streams of water racing each other down the panes. "It's like the sky is singing," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas, on the other hand, was eager to be outside. "Can we go check the stream?" he asked, excitement gleaming in his eyes. William chuckled and nodded, fetching their raincloaks before stepping out into the cool drizzle with his son. The stream had turned into a rushing current, its clear waters tumbling over rocks that had been dry just days before. Thomas watched in awe as small whirlpools formed and broke apart, the water carving new paths through the land. "It's alive," he said, marveling at the way nature shifted with the seasons. William nodded knowingly, explaining how the monsoon rejuvenated the land, bringing life to dormant seeds and feeding the deep roots of the trees. Back at the cottage, Lena and Eliza prepared for the indoor season that the rains would bring. Dried herbs were sorted into glass jars, and bundles of lavender and rosemary were tied together to hang from the rafters, their fragrance mingling with the steady crackle of the fire. The cellar, filled with preserves and dried goods, was checked once more to ensure that no moisture had seeped in. The family had spent weeks preparing, making sure they had enough provisions to sustain them through the rains. Days in the rain followed a slower rhythm. The family gathered around the hearth, Lena teaching Eliza how to embroider delicate patterns into linen, while William and Thomas carved new wooden spoons and bowls for their kitchen. Outside, the rain drummed against the roof, a constant melody that wrapped the cottage in a cocoon of warmth. As evening approached, the rain turned softer, a gentle mist rising from the fields. The family gathered on the covered porch, wrapped in woolen shawls, listening to the steady drumming of raindrops on the wooden roof. Lena poured steaming cups of chamomile tea, sweetened with honey, while Eliza curled up beside her, content in the quiet embrace of the moment. William leaned against the wooden railing, watching as fireflies danced in the mist, their soft glow adding to the magic of the evening. Dinner was a comforting affair. Hot stew, fresh bread, and thick slices of cheese. William shared stories of his childhood, of the first time he had seen the river rise with the monsoons and how his father had taught him to respect the power of water. Eliza listened wide-eyed, imagining the great waves crashing against the riverbanks and the trees swaying wildly in the storm. Later that night, as the rain continued its steady rhythm, the Greenwood family drifted into sleep, the land cradling them in its cool, damp embrace. The candlelight flickered against the stone walls, casting shadows that moved with the dancing flames. The sound of distant thunder rumbled through the hills, a lullaby only nature could compose. The rain would continue for days, nourishing the land and preparing it for the cycle to begin again. The family welcomed it, knowing that the monsoon was not just about waiting. It was a time of rest, of patience, and of cherishing the simpler moments of togetherness. In their hilltop haven, the Greenwoods remained sheltered, at peace with the rhythm of nature's dance. The storm would pass, the land would dry, and soon the sun would return. But for now, the family embraced the rain, letting it weave its quiet magic into their home and hearts. The Whisper of the Woods. As the rain-soaked earth began to dry, the air grew crisp with the first whispers of autumn. The leaves at the edge of the forest slowly shifted from green to hues of amber and gold, their edges curling in preparation for the coming season. The Greenwood family knew that this was the time to gather, to prepare, and to store the land's final gifts before winter's hush would settle upon the hills. William rose with the dawn, stepping outside to find a cool breeze rustling through the trees. The scent of damp soil still clung to the morning air, but the mist that once shrouded the valley was beginning to lift. He took a deep breath, feeling the subtle change in the season. Autumn had arrived. Inside, Lena prepared a hearty breakfast of thick oat porridge sweetened with honey, paired with warm bread spread with butter and fig preserves. The scent of cinnamon and cloves drifted through the cottage, a sign that her autumn spices were already in use. Thomas and Eliza hurried to finish their meal, eager to join their father in the forest for the first gathering of firewood and nuts. The forest was alive in its own way, despite the cooling weather. Squirrels darted between the trees, stuffing their mouths with acorns, while birds called out in sharp melodies, perhaps preparing their final songs before migration. William led his children through the worn forest paths, pointing out fallen branches and explaining which types of wood would burn best for the coming winter. Thomas, now old enough to carry his own axe, took careful swings at smaller logs, practicing the method his father had taught him. Meanwhile, Eliza gathered walnuts and chestnuts from the ground, her small hands brushing away damp leaves as she filled her basket. Every now and then she would pause, admiring the way sunlight filtered through the thinning canopy, setting the forest floor aglow with golden light. Lena remained at home, preserving the last of the summer harvest. Apples were peeled and strung to dry, while the final batches of tomatoes were boiled into thick sauces for winter stews. She hummed softly as she worked, her hands moving skillfully between tasks, sealing jars, tying cloth covers, and stacking them neatly in the cellar. Each jar was a promise of warmth in the cold days to come. By noon, the family returned with their haul, their arms laden with bundles of firewood and their baskets full of foraged nuts and mushrooms. They laid everything out to dry in the open air, while William sorted through the larger logs, setting them aside for chopping. As the afternoon stretched on, the sky shifted to a soft, overcast gray. A cool wind rustled through the orchard, sending a handful of golden leaves drifting across the yard. The family took their work indoors, gathering around the large wooden table. Lena roasted the chestnuts over the hearth, their rich, nutty aroma filling the room as she cracked them open one by one. Eliza curled up beside the fire, threading together garlands of dried apples and cinnamon sticks, humming the same tune her mother had sung earlier. Thomas, still full of energy, practiced his whittling skills, carving small figures from spare wood, while William sharpened the tools that would be needed for the colder months ahead. As dusk fell, Lena prepared a simple but satisfying supper. Thick vegetable stew simmered with herbs, fresh bread, and a warm spiced cider made from the apples they had stored. The family gathered around the wooden table, their meal illuminated by the soft glow of oil lamps. They ate slowly, savoring the flavors, their laughter and conversation filling the cozy space. After supper, William pulled his chair closer to the fire, recounting stories from his own childhood, of the autumns he had spent exploring these same hills, of the harvest feasts his mother used to prepare, and of the way the wind would always whisper through the woods just before the first frost. The children listened intently, their eyes heavy with sleep but unwilling to miss a single word. Later that night, after the fire had died down to embers, Lena took a final walk outside, letting the cool autumn air fill her lungs. The sky was clear, the stars twinkling above the hills like tiny lanterns. She wrapped her shawl tighter around herself, feeling the quiet magic of the season settling in. The whispers of the woods had changed. Summer's song had faded, and in its place came the gentle hum of leaves falling, of animals preparing for rest, and of the earth slowly tucking itself in for winter's arrival. It was a time of gathering, of preparing, and of finding peace in the steady rhythm of life on the hilltop. Inside the cottage, the Greenwood family slept soundly, their dreams woven with the golden hues of autumn and the quiet whispers of the land they called home. The hearth and the snow. Winter crept into the hilltop quietly, its arrival marked by the first frost that painted the meadows in silver. The once golden trees now stood bare, their branches etched against the pale sky, while the earth hardened beneath the weight of the cooling air. The Greenwood family had long prepared for this season, but no matter how many winters they had seen, the sight of the first snowfall never failed to bring a hush of awe. William woke before dawn, stepping onto the porch where the air smelled of crisp snow and distant pine. He tugged his coat tighter around him and gazed at the slow dance of snowflakes falling against the dim light of the lantern. The wind whistled through the trees, sending a soft rustle across the barren orchard. Inside, Lena stirred the embers of the hearth, coaxing warmth back into the home. The aroma of freshly baked bread filled the air, mixing with the woody scent of burning logs. She wrapped a thick shawl around her shoulders as she checked the pot of porridge bubbling over the fire. The children would need hearty meals now that winter had fully settled in. Thomas and Eliza stirred beneath their blankets, reluctant to leave the cocoon of warmth their beds provided. But the call of morning chores was inevitable, and soon they bundled into layers of wool, rubbing sleep from their eyes as they trudged to the barn. The cow's breath misted in the icy air as Thomas filled their troughs with fresh hay. Eliza carried buckets of warm water, watching as steam curled from the surface in the cold air. The morning passed in a steady rhythm, the family working together to keep the home running through the bitter season. While William and Thomas chopped firewood, stacking it high against the stone wall of the cottage, Lena and Eliza busied themselves with preparing the pantry. Jars of preserved fruits and vegetables, sealed tightly from the autumn's harvest, lined the shelves beside bundles of dried herbs and sacks of grains. Lena placed a pot of mulled cider on the stove, letting its spiced aroma seep into every corner of the home. Afternoons were slower in winter. The snowfall thickened outside, blanketing the land in soft silence. Thomas sat by the window, carving small wooden figurines with his father's old knife. Eliza embroidered patterns onto linen, her stitches careful and precise under Lena's watchful eye. William settled in his chair, pipe in hand, watching the fire flicker and listening to the comforting sounds of home. As the sky darkened, the family gathered around the dining table for supper. Tonight, Lena had made thick venison stew, its rich broth steaming in the cold air. They ate slowly, savoring each bite, grateful for the warmth of food and the company of one another. After the meal, William fetched his old fiddle, playing slow, lilting tunes that echoed against the wooden walls. Eliza and Thomas swayed sleepily to the music, their bodies heavy with the comfort of a full belly and a warm fire. Before bed, they stepped outside one last time, drawn by the brilliance of the night sky. The snow-covered land shimmered under the glow of the moon, the air still and hushed. Lena sighed, the cold stinging her cheeks, but a smile tugged at her lips. Winter was harsh, but it was also beautiful in its quiet way. As they retreated inside, the fire crackled, its warmth seeping into their bones. The Greenwood family drifted into sleep, cocooned in the deep peace of their hilltop haven, as the snow continued its gentle descent, wrapping their world in silence and serenity. The Festival of Lights. Winter held the hilltop in its quiet embrace, the land frozen under a blanket of white. The Greenwood family had learned to move at the pace of the season, slowing down with the shorter days and finding warmth in the small traditions they held dear. One such tradition was the Festival of Lights, a night of celebration, storytelling, and the welcoming of the coming year. The preparations began early in the morning, as Lena and Eliza gathered beeswax candles from the pantry. They had been molded during autumn, set aside for this special evening. With careful hands, Eliza placed them in handmade lanterns, their glass panes reflecting the morning light. Thomas, bundled in his thickest coat, retrieved the wooden torches stored in the barn, brushing off the fine layer of frost that had settled on them overnight. William and Thomas set to work clearing a space in the yard where the bonfire would be lit. The snow crunched beneath their boots as they gathered fallen branches and stacked them carefully. The firewood had been drying for months, ensuring that it would burn strong and steady against the chill of the night. Inside the cottage, Lena and Eliza filled the kitchen with warmth and scent. The festival feast was simple yet indulgent. Freshly baked bread, thick stew with root vegetables, honey-roasted nuts, and spiced cider. As the stew simmered on the hearth, Lena kneaded dough for pastries, the golden crusts promising a sweet treat by nightfall. The room smelled of cinnamon and cloves, filling the home with the comfort of familiarity. By late afternoon, the sky had turned a soft lavender, the sun dipping lower behind the snow-laden trees. The children hung garlands of dried berries and pine branches around the door, while William checked the lanterns one last time. As dusk approached, the Greenwood family gathered in thick woolen cloaks, each carrying a lantern as they stepped outside into the crisp evening air. The bonfire roared to life, its flames dancing against the night. Thomas and Eliza cheered as the warmth spread, pushing back the cold. They placed their lanterns along the path leading to the house, the small flickering lights guiding the way like stars fallen from the sky. Lena passed around steaming mugs of cider, and the family settled around the fire. This was a night for storytelling, for recalling the year that had passed and looking forward to the days ahead. William shared memories of his youth, of winters spent much the same way, gathered around a fire with family and friends. Lena spoke of her grandmother, who had taught her the importance of small traditions, of finding joy in the simplest of moments. Eliza, her cheeks rosy from the cold, leaned against her mother, listening intently. "Do you think next year will be just as beautiful?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. William smiled, gazing at the flames. "Every year is beautiful in its own way," he said, "so long as we have each other and the land to guide us." As the night deepened, they placed their last logs on the fire, watching as the embers glowed warmly. The festival was not about grand festivities or lavish celebrations, but about togetherness, about marking the passage of time with gratitude and hope. One by one, the lanterns flickered out as the Greenwood family returned inside, carrying the warmth of the evening with them. The fire and the hearth crackled softly, and as they drifted into sleep, the last whispers of the festival night carried on the wind, promising another year of quiet, steadfast joy. The first buds of spring, winter's hold on the hilltop loosened as the days grew longer. The snow, once thick and unyielding, softened under the gentle warmth of the returning sun. The Greenwood family had spent the last months in quiet retreat, relying on their stores of food and the steady glow of the hearth to carry them through. But now, with the first hints of spring in the air, the time had come to awaken the land once more. William stepped outside early one morning, boots crunching over the lingering frost. A breeze carried the scent of damp earth and melting snow. A promise of renewal whispered through the valley. He knelt by the garden beds, brushing away the last of the ice to reveal dark, rich soil underneath. The season's first work had begun. Inside the cottage, Lena prepared breakfast, warm porridge sweetened with honey, thick slices of bread toasted over the fire, and fresh butter churned just the day before. The children, now accustomed to the slower winter pace, stirred sleepily, but soon perked up at the thought of returning to the fields. There was something invigorating about stepping outside after so many weeks spent indoors. The morning passed in a flurry of activity. Thomas and William turned the soil in the garden, preparing it for the first round of planting. Eliza, skipping through the orchard, searched for the first signs of blossoms. The apple and peach trees still stood bare, but she knew it wouldn't be long before their branches exploded in delicate pink and white petals. Lena sorted through the seed packets, carefully selecting those best suited for early planting. Lettuce, peas, carrots, and onions, hardy crops that could withstand the occasional late frost. She handed them to Eliza, who eagerly knelt beside the garden bed and began placing them into the soil with careful precision. By midday, the family gathered beneath the great oak tree for a short rest. Lena poured cool water into clay cups, while William shared his plans for expanding the beehives this year. "The bees will wake soon," he said, watching the first insects dart hesitantly from their wooden hives, "and we'll need more space for them to thrive." The thought of honey filled Eliza's mind. She loved the process of collecting it, watching the golden liquid drip from the combs and into the glass jars. It was a tradition that reminded her of the cycle of life on the hilltop, each season bringing something new yet familiar. As the afternoon stretched on, the family continued their work. Lena hung the first set of laundry outside to dry, the linens fluttering in the crisp breeze. Thomas helped mend the wooden fence, hammering the last nails into place while William inspected the roof for any winter damage. The scent of damp earth filled the air, mingling with the distant call of birds returning from their winter journey. As the sun dipped lower, the family retreated inside. Supper was simple yet satisfying. A pot of vegetable soup simmered over the fire, fresh bread slathered with butter, and a small bowl of dried fruit from their autumn harvest. They ate together, their conversations lively, laughter filling the cozy space. Before bed, Eliza peered outside, hoping to catch another sign of spring. Her heart leaped as she spotted the first crocus pushing through the thawing ground, its pale purple petals catching the moonlight. She ran inside, excitement bubbling in her voice as she shared her discovery with her family. William chuckled, tussling her hair. "The land is waking up," he said, "and so are we." That night, as the Greenwood family drifted into sleep, the wind carried the soft rustling of new leaves, the promise of warmer days ahead. Spring had begun its slow but steady return, and with it the cycle of life on the hilltop would begin anew. The eternal rhythm of summer. Spring had melted into summer, bringing golden days and warm starlit nights. The Greenwood family welcomed the shift with open arms, embracing the longer hours of daylight and the abundance that came with it. The land, now fully awake, thrived under the watchful care of the family who had tended it for generations. William rose early, stepping onto the dew-kissed grass before the sun had fully risen. The sky was painted in soft pastels, the first golden rays stretching over the hilltops. He inhaled deeply, savoring the scent of blooming wildflowers and fresh earth. Summer was a season of plenty, and today was a day of work. Inside the cottage, Lena had already begun preparing breakfast. Fluffy scrambled eggs from their hens, thick slices of toast, and a jug of fresh milk, still warm from the morning milking. The scent of frying herbs filled the air as she worked. Eliza helped set the table while Thomas stacked logs by the stove, ensuring a steady supply of firewood for the day's cooking. The routine was familiar, comforting, and deeply rooted in the changing seasons. After breakfast, the family ventured into the orchard, baskets in hand. The trees were heavy with fruit. Apples, pears, cherries, and plums hung in clusters, waiting to be picked. Thomas climbed the sturdy branches, plucking the ripest apples and tossing them down to Eliza, who caught them in the folds of her apron. Lena carefully selected peaches for preserving, their fuzzy skin warm under the afternoon sun. William worked in the vegetable garden, harvesting carrots and potatoes, while ensuring the tomato vines were supported against the summer breeze. Bees hummed between rows of flowering herbs, their presence a reassuring sign of the ecosystem thriving in perfect balance. "The bees are busier than ever," he said, watching them dart between the lavender and thyme. "We'll have a fine batch of honey this year." By midday, the family retreated to the shade of the great oak tree, sipping cool water and wiping sweat from their brows. The air buzzed with the sounds of nature, the chirping of crickets, the distant call of a hawk, the rustling of leaves shifting in the breeze. Thomas sprawled on the grass, watching the clouds drift lazily overhead. "Do you think the land ever tires of giving?" he mused. Lena smiled, running her fingers over the rim of her glass. "No, my love," she said softly. "It only asks that we care for it in return." The afternoon brought the task of preserving the harvest. In the kitchen, Lena and Eliza worked over bubbling pots, turning ripe fruit into jams and compotes. The scent of cinnamon and sugar filled the air as jars were sealed and set aside, their golden contents capturing the sweetness of summer. Thomas and William strained fresh honey into glass containers, marveling at its amber hue. Each jar a reminder of the tireless work of the bees and the bounty of the land. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in strokes of pink and orange, the family gathered outside for supper. A simple meal, freshly baked bread, a bowl of crisp greens, roasted vegetables, and slices of juicy peaches, was laid out on the wooden table. They ate as the first fireflies began to flicker in the twilight, their glow mirroring the soft candlelight that illuminated the porch. After dinner, William fetched his fiddle, the familiar notes of an old folk tune drifting into the evening air. Eliza swayed to the melody, her laughter mingling with the night sounds of the countryside. Thomas tapped his foot in rhythm, his hands still sticky from honey, as Lena watched with quiet contentment. As night fell, the Greenwood family lingered under the vast sky, counting stars and sharing whispered dreams for the days ahead. The land, in its quiet generosity, had provided for them once more, and as the cool summer breeze rustled through the fields, they knew that this was the rhythm of life, steady, unbroken, and full of endless wonder. Summer would pass, and autumn would follow. But for now, under the canopy of stars and the hum of crickets, they reveled in the fullness of the present, the eternal dance of the Hilltop Haven continuing on as it always had and as it always would. The Autumn Harvest and Winter's Whisper. As the golden days of summer faded, autumn arrived with a quiet grace, painting the hills in deep hues of amber, rust, and crimson. The crisp air carried the scent of fallen leaves and ripe fruit, and the Greenwood family prepared for the season of harvest. The days were still long, but the mornings carried a sharpness, a reminder that winter was not far behind. William rose before dawn, stepping out to find a thin veil of mist rolling over the fields. He took a deep breath, inhaling the familiar scent of damp earth, and the distant sweetness of apples ripening on the trees. There was work to be done. Before the frost came, they had to gather the final gifts of the land. Inside the cottage, Lena had already begun kneading dough for the morning bread, her hands moving rhythmically against the wooden surface. Eliza sat by the hearth, peeling apples for pies, while Thomas inspected the firewood, ensuring they had enough logs stacked to last through the colder months. By the time the sun had fully risen, the family was already deep into the harvest. The orchard, now heavy with apples, pears, and late-season plums, beckoned them to gather its bounty. William climbed the ladders to reach the highest branches, shaking the trees gently as Thomas and Eliza collected the fruit in woven baskets. Nearby, Lena sorted through pumpkins and squash, their thick orange skins glowing in the soft autumn sunlight. Midday brought a well-earned break beneath the oak tree, its leaves now tinged with red. Lena poured warm cider into clay cups, its cinnamon-laced aroma mingling with the crisp air. They ate thick slices of bread with fresh butter, savoring the fruits of their labor. As they rested, the wind carried the distant call of geese flying south, a sure sign that the season's turn was in full swing. The afternoons were spent preserving the harvest. Inside the kitchen, the fireplace crackled as Lena and Eliza worked on canning apple preserves and pickling vegetables. The scent of bubbling spices filled the room, while Thomas and William stored away bushels of dried corn and grain in the cellar. Every jar, every bundle, was a promise of comfort for the cold days ahead. As dusk fell, the family gathered for a hearty meal. Stew made with the last of the garden vegetables, warm cornbread with honey, and spiced apple tarts fresh from the oven. They ate slowly, grateful for the abundance before them, knowing it was the result of months of careful tending and patience. After supper, William took out his carving knife, fashioning wooden figures for the festival that marked the change of seasons. Eliza curled beside Lena, listening to stories of autumns past, of how her grandmother used to bake endless loaves of bread and sing by the fire while the winds howled outside. Thomas sat sharpening tools, already thinking ahead to winter's tasks. As the night deepened, a cold breeze rustled the shutters. The stars shimmered above the quiet land, and the distant hoot of an owl echoed through the trees. The first frost would come soon, and the Greenwood family knew they would welcome it, just as they had welcomed every season before. Inside the warm glow of their home, they embraced the rhythm of the land, preparing for the quiet stillness of winter. The fire burned steadily in the hearth, a symbol of the life they had built, self-sufficient, steadfast, and full of quiet wonder. And as sleep settled over them, the whisper of the wind carried a gentle promise. Another cycle, another season, another year in their Hilltop Haven. Thank you for joining us on Story Planet. If you felt the warmth of the fire, the scent of the harvest, and the peace of the quiet hilltop, consider giving a thumbs up. And if this story brought you comfort and a gentle escape, feel free to share it with friends and family. Don't forget to subscribe for more soothing tales from Story Planet, bringing you peaceful journeys every day. Wishing you a restful night and the sweetest dreams.